Hello, I'm very pleased to announce that I've settled my legal claims after our new Labour government conceded that the Conservatives had acted unlawfully in both cases. In short, we have won with the help of a new government that appears to see some sense in meeting some real net zero commitments. Now, the first claim I brought challenged the decisions announced by Rishi Sunak in his net zero speech on the 20th of September 2023. They included a delay on the ban on the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030 to 2035, a delay on the ban of the installation of new fossil fuel boilers in homes from 2026 to 2035, to indefinitely exempt around 20% of homes from the ban on the installation of new gas boilers from 2035, and finally to abandon the policy to require landlords to improve the energy efficiency of their rental properties. Those policies were all key elements of the then government's carbon budget delivery plan that had been laid out after an extensive consultation process less than 6 months earlier. But then Sunak said they were to be dumped. The problem with this is that it would expand the shortfall in quantified emission savings from 3% to 10%, and Sunak and Coutinho didn't put in place any policies to make up that shortfall. To quote their colleague Braverman, those policy changes were reckless and irresponsible. My second claim challenged Sunak's government's decision that even though their plans fell short by 10%, they were still compliant with their duty under the Climate Change Act. My legal team argued this was not an option for the government to assume that that gap could somehow be magically bridged. Their actions meant that ministers were relying on mere hope without any evidence that changes in the economy and technological improvements would somehow come to the rescue. Again, reckless and irresponsible. So, the current government has concluded that the gas boiler and the landlord decisions were unlawful. Why? Well, because there'd been extensive consultations on both of those policies, which the public and industry had spent thousands of hours participating in and preparing detailed representations to inform government decision-making. But the Tory ministers unlawfully chose to ignore all of that. They didn't even read a summary of the consultation responses. Now, although our new government has not agreed that the other decisions announced by Sunak were unlawful, it has agreed to reconsider all of those decisions, which says enough, of course. The government has also conceded that the assertion that the Conservatives were compliant with their duty under the Climate Change Act to have a plan in place that would enable the carbon budgets to be met was unlawful, and that the information available to them was insufficient to conclude that the carbon budgets could really be met. They were playing fast and loose with our future. Anyway, our new government's concession is a vindication of both of my claims, and I'm very pleased that we managed to reach this point without having to argue it in court. But, having said that, the government hasn't conceded some parts of the case that I consider to be important. It hasn't conceded that its predecessor acted unlawfully in failing to inform us about the real effects of the policies announced in Sunak's net zero speech, and even telling us about that 10% shortfall in meeting its net zero commitments. In fact, I can tell you the only reason that we know about the massive scale of that shortfall is because of these legal proceedings. It was the only way they were brought into the public domain. Now, obviously, if this new government repeats that approach, I'll be back on the case. Simply because the social and economic transition required to meet net zero is huge, and it involves all parts of the economy and society. As a consequence, we all have an interest in how the country is going to meet its targets, and I'm advised that the law requires any government to inform us about any material changes in its plans to do so, and that therefore means that transparency is absolutely essential. The government has agreed to pay the cost of both cases up to the cap of £35,000 each, and the Secretary of State for Energy and Net Zero, Ed Miliband, has invited me to meet with him to discuss that need for transparency in decision making around climate change. I'm very much looking forward to that meeting and obviously I'll report back. Lastly, I'd very much like to thank my legal team, Carol Day, Rowan Smith and Julia Erickson at Lee Day, David Wolfe and Toby Fisher from Matrix Chambers, and Catherine Dobson from Essex Chambers. And then, of course, I'd like to thank all of those of you who so generously donated to the Crowd Justice Appeal. Thank you very much. This was, I believe, a very important case, and on this occasion, we came out on top.